I'll ask everyone to kindly silence or turn off their phones. We held a session at the Smithsonian last month in a room that had been shielded so that the phones wouldn't work. And that's going to become more of a common thing, I think, to shut down the cell phone thing. I'm Mike Swetnam, and I'd like to welcome you to the 14th Annual Terrorism Review, sponsored by the Potomac Institute. It has been our pleasure at the Potomac Institute for the last decade and a half to be involved in the study of terrorism, and in particular, the study of the use by terrorists and terror organizations in the use of technology to foment evil. Every year we gather, usually here in the Press Club, to discuss the events surrounding terrorism and the issues as they have developed over the past year. This past year, I think many people can agree, has been a very, very positive year with the death of Osama bin Laden and most of the leaders of al-Qaeda around the world. In fact, it's becoming hard to find anyone left who will call themselves a leader of al-Qaeda, because that immediately pins a target on their back, and it doesn't seem to be very long before a Predator aircraft is following them around and knocking them off. So it's been a very, very positive year. I would note, however, that as we note and celebrate the success in eliminating those who have practiced terror over the last decade, we have not eliminated or not diminished too greatly the ideas and the movements that have spurred these terrorists to attack us and others. And in fact, the use of the method of terror as a weapon of war is as prevalent today as it has ever been. More and more regimes like Iran are tempted to use terror as a tool against us and others in the free world for a variety of reasons. So as we celebrate a banner year in the war against terrorism, it's worthy to note that the battle is long from over, and in fact we'll probably be engaging in this battle during the time of our children and our grandchildren. We've assembled a panel, as we do every year, of true experts to talk about terrorism, not just as it has challenged the United States, but as it has threatened the world. With us today are some of the representatives of countries around the world who have fought this cause with us, and we're very happy to receive their reports and their assessments. I would like to note the publication yesterday, actually, I believe, of a 10-year anniversary book by Professor Yona Alexander and myself on al-Qaeda that is out and available, and we'll be glad to provide copies to those who'd like to have them today. We're very proud of the work that Professor Alexander and his students and the center at the Potomac Institute has engaged in studying a number of terror groups, but particularly al-Qaeda, in fact, long before 9/11. And with that, I'd like to introduce the man who has probably given more and done more in the academic study of terrorism worldwide than any individual alive today. In fact, he has published well over 110 books. He has led thousands of seminars and has been a world leader in the academic study of every form and every type of terrorism that we've experienced in the history of mankind. It's my great privilege to be partnered and associated with Professor Yona Alexander.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your very generous introduction. I just received on the iPhone before we turned it over from a colleague whom I invited to come here and to participate with us. Unfortunately, he's on international travel. But he said, in essence, he said, 10 years after 9/11, I'm so glad that you and not bin Laden are around. Basically, I think, not to be immodest about this, we do certainly have a safer world. And the problem is that there are many challenges and we're going to discuss them today with our very distinguished panel. I would like to welcome the panel. I would like to welcome also the audience and those who are going to be the next scholars in the field, those who contributed work on this particular book, as well as another study that we're going to launch today related to the Arab Spring and the Maghreb, North Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, because after all, as Mike indicated, that bin Laden was killed, but the idea still survives, and those affiliates are all over the world, alive, well, and kicking. And one of the most troublesome areas is, of course, as we can see in North Africa, in Central Africa, West Africa, particularly the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, that has links with other groups around the world, all the way in Africa, in Nigeria, for example, in terms of narco trafficking, weapon trafficking, recruitment, attacks, as well as mercenaries, for example, those from the Polisario working together with Gaddafi before, during the spring situation there. Now, what I would like to do, because of the interest of time, and we have a very distinguished group, I would like simply to mention again, and I see many faces, people that we do know from previous years. Actually, since 9/11, I tried to count, and we had 20 sessions right here at the National Press Club. In fact, at this very room, I recall, Mike, that several years ago, we had at that time, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia, al-Tariki, who was also the chief of intelligence, and he expressed his concern about sub-state as well as state-sponsored terrorism. In fact, last week, he came out with a statement that the international community should consider a military sanctions. He didn't name it, but we know exactly what he meant in terms of development of nuclear weapons. But again, we have to be concerned not only about the nuclear, but weapons of mass destruction in general. For example, great concern now about the proliferation of weapons after Gaddafi, including anti-aircraft missiles, chemical weapons, the same thing about Syria. So again, there are many, many concerns, but we are not going to give in and give up. It is up to the international community to respond. And with this in mind, I would like to introduce a very distinguished panel. Actually, they don't need any introduction. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into their bios. But again, you can look at this very at your leisure. But the only thing I would like to say that we do have a very distinguished panel, experts as well as diplomats, and we're very grateful to the diplomatic community right here in Washington who supported our academic work over the years. So our first panelist, if you look at the program, is Honorable Charlie Allen, the former Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and former Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Collection and the CIA. And the bottom line is that Charlie is a legend. Please.
Thank you, Professor Alexander, for that very generous introduction. And it's very great again to be back and to be part of a Potomac Institute function. My hat is off to Mike Svetman and the great work he does. Professor Alexander requested I stay to about 10 minutes, so I will try to do this. I think to some degree what Mike Svetman said is, he summarized it in a very short few sentences. The world has changed. Al-Qaeda, the world jihadist movement has changed. In some respects, it has been for the good, as we know, the death of bin Laden, and for the death of many of his followers. To be a leader, to be in charge of external operations does not seem to be a very healthy thing. My view is that Al-Qaeda reached its high water mark about 2006, 2007. At that stage, you had Ubaida al-Masri, who was head of the external operations. He appeared to want to bring in people from the West, people who found their way to the West. They weren't really recruited in the West, to be able to come and after vetting to be trained to come back to the West. And there were dozens of them. And they were from Europe and they were from North America. And they understood the culture, they had the language, they understood the customs. And the view was at that stage that this would be a great way to insert operatives in here who could conduct another major attack on the country, particularly the United States, but also to attack in Western Europe if necessary. Well, that didn't work out that way. Starting in July '08, with the death of Abu Khabab al-Masri, and since then, as Mike said, most of the Al-Qaeda senior leaders have died. They simply died. And there are some left. We do have al-Zawahiri, who certainly is an interesting individual, and if you've read some of the books about Al-Qaeda, you'll know that this is a man who has great dedication and fanaticism, but he is non-charismatic. He is not a bin Laden, not in any sense. He's a rather dour guy. And the view, publicly, the National Counterterrorism Center said at one time, a year or so ago, that maybe there are only 300 Al-Qaeda members still in the federal administered tribal area, and less than perhaps 100 actually operational inside Afghanistan. Now, just because Al-Qaeda Central or its core is having great difficulty doesn't mean we face a dangerous situation, because we do. One, there are affiliated networks in Pakistan, in the Fatah area in the Northwest Province. There is a Tariq-i-Taliban led by Hakimullah Maqsood, who has promised vengeance upon the United States because of the death of his brother, Baktullah Maqsood, back in 2009. And we also had TTP, Tariq-i-Taliban, trained Faisal Shahzad, who tried to set off a bomb in Times Square. Unfortunately, he didn't learn how to make a bomb. Fortunately, he didn't know how to make a bomb, and no one was killed, not even an explosion. And we also have the Haqqani network, which has been written about a great deal in the press, led by Siraj Haqqani. It also trains a lot of operatives to go into Afghanistan. U.S. forces apparently have killed a lot of Haqqani-trained operatives. There's also, of course, the question of how to deal with these. Does the Haqqani network groom people for suicide operations? I tend to think it probably does. So this network remains dangerous, like the TTP, but they're regionally based, tribally based. They're not the kind of group that's going to sustain a global jihad. And then there's the Tariq-i-Taliban. The Lashkar-e-Taiba, rather, which is operationally active in the Northwest Province. It led the attack on the Indian Parliament back in 2001. It, after many months of training, unleashed the attack on Mumbai, which occurred on 26-30 November 2008. I know Ambassador Singh may have something to say about it. That was a devastating attack, and it demonstrated a small group of people can do a great deal of damage, and a great deal create not only human casualties, damage critical infrastructure, and damage the psyche of the people where the attack occurs. But there is good news out there. Jamaat Islamiyah down in Southeast Asia remains dormant. We could talk about that. There is Abu Sayyaf group over in the Philippines, which Kofor Black, who once ran CTC, always said it was more a group of thugs than ideologically oriented individuals. And I think that's true. But I believe Professor Alexander also talked about dangerous affiliates remaining. He talked about Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is active. It's an umbrella group of a number of movements that was organized and recognized back in 2007, I believe, when it was unified under AQIM. So what do we see in AQIM? It controls a great deal of Mali, the desert areas. It conducts attacks on the apostate governments in what it calls as apostate governments in North Africa. It did the attack in Marrakesh, where 15 or so people were killed, mostly Westerners. So it's quite active. The most active group, however, is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which was, until his demise, led by Anwar al-Awlaki for external operations. AQAP is active and controls parts of this rather ungoverned areas of Yemen. From my perspective, AQAP is, on its international operations, is a little bit in disarray with the death of al-Awlaki, with the death of Samir Khan, who happened to be killed with al-Awlaki. Inspire, which had 8 editions coming out, which was electronic journal which went throughout the world, was inspiring people. So I think we have to remain deeply concerned about AQAP. It does not seem to be internationally active right now, but it will presumably regroup. And then we have Al-Shabaab over in East Africa, which remains quite active. There's an American leader there that certainly has interest in attacking the United States and has said so. The great danger, of course, is Somali Americans who have gone there, have trained there, and some have martyred themselves there. And then over in West Africa, probably one of the more interesting and most dangerous groups that we have to deal with is Boko Haram, which is already attacked an international target. Back on the 26th of August, 2011, it attacked the UN compound in Abuja, killed 9 UN members, killed 23 persons, wounded many dozens others. And now it's conducted a wave of attacks throughout northern Nigeria. I think this is something we'll have to see if it's going to go further and if it's going to attack internationally. So when you look at all of this, you look at where does this leave us? It leaves us with a global jihad in great decline. It also, though, leaves us with a powerful communications device known as the Internet. It leaves us with hundreds of websites that are jihadist and extremist websites. And as the core of Al-Qaeda has atrophied, there has been a growth in this country and in North America of people who are listening to the siren call of the jihad. Now, the new national strategy for counterterrorism recognizes that primarily we have to worry about things here in the United States to a large extent. We have to continue this international attack led by the United States with its allies, some of whom are here on the platform with me, and it's been greatly successful. But the Internet is a primary means by which Al-Qaeda globally communicates. We do find that some people have listened to this, and of course they've been arrested. Most of their attempts have been rudimentary. They've not been sophisticated. But it only takes one attack, as we saw in Mumbai, to really traumatize a nation and create great damage. So we have a hollowed out Al-Qaeda core. We have a global jihad that's had its problems. Professor Alexander talked a little bit about the Arab Spring. Al-Qaeda has been left behind in that. Will it be left behind in the long term? I think these are issues that we have to talk about. Political Islam. Will political Islam dominate some of the new states in the Middle East? It appears that will be the case. And how do we reconcile and deal with political Islam? But in the final analysis, I think we have to be very serious. A weakened al-Qaeda globally does not mean that we have an organization that is still not capable and determined to strike blows at the United States, or that there will not be further attacks here in the United States. Al-Qaeda has not successfully attacked inbound since 9/11, although we've disrupted big plans, the aviation plot in 2006 and the Hewlett-Packard jet cartridges back in 2010. That was a very serious issue. Homegrown terrorism here in this country is a reality, but it's small. I think the administration recognizes this. It's put out a strategy for combating radicalization. It's one I think we have to pay attention to and to follow. But I think what Americans have to do is to recognize what we have. It's a sustained global effort to combat extremism, and it's going to go on for decades to come. It has been a banner year as we look back with the death of al-Qaeda and continuing atrophy of al-Qaeda globally, but there are still additional chapters yet to be played out. Thank you.
Let me give you a copy of our book, and thank you for writing the foreword to it, by the way, too.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. You raised a lot of important questions that will come to them. Our next speaker, according to the program, is Dan Rosen. Currently is Director of Plans and Policy at the new Bureau of Counterterrorism in the U.S. Department of State. He worked at the Counterterrorism office before, and prior to that, he worked at NDU in this area. Dan?
I'm a little shorter than Chuck, so. Thank you, Dr. Alexander, and I want to thank you for this series of events that our office has been extremely active in, and we've tried to be a great supporter of Potomac Institute and your events, and I'm glad to be part of that group now, frankly. I'm also happy to see on the platform and share the platform with some of my colleagues from some of our most valuable CT partners, and we cooperate with all of them, all of the countries represented here, on a very regular basis. I also really, in some ways, want to echo what Chuck said and what Mike said. I think it was a very good summary of about where we are. Last year, this past year was quite a good year in some ways, but the resilience of al-Qaeda's ideology continues to be a vexing problem. I want to talk a little bit about where we've been over the last year and where we think we're going from the State Department perspective and specifically from the CT perspective in the State Department. There is really no question that bin Laden's departure from the scene was the most important milestone in the fight against al-Qaeda. He was an iconic figure and an irreplaceable figure in many ways that had a profound attraction in terms of his personal story. Even when he had to spend many years limiting his contacts with the organization, he was really more deeply involved in directing its operations and its strategy than even we had expected. His loss and the loss of others such as Abdul Rahman, Harun Fazul, Anwar al-Awlaki puts the group really on a path of decline that we think will be difficult to reverse. Despite all that, AQ has shown resilience and continues to operate in worrisome ways and pose a threat continuing to our national security. The activity of AQ affiliates, which Chuck talked quite a great deal about, is really where a lot of our concerns lie. Obviously, the AQ core is still somewhat active, and we're concerned there. But what AQAP is doing, what AQIM is doing, and what Al-Shabaab is doing continues to concern us. AQIM report, I think, is particularly timely. It's an issue that has grown in prominence certainly over the last year, particularly as AQIM fills its coffers with ransom money being paid from kidnappings. Those resources really do sort of take AQIM to the next level in some ways, and we're seeing some worrisome trends there. The other worrisome trend of late, of course, is in Nigeria. While Boko Haram is not an AQ affiliate, we have seen in some of their tactics, and in particular the UN headquarters bombing in Abuja, tactics that signal a turn toward the type of targeting and the type of operations that AQ has been engaged in for a long time. That's kind of the bad news, I would say, over the past year. But I think on the good news side of the ledger, one of the mostly unsung successes has to do with really the extraordinary level of cooperation we have achieved in counterterrorism. And behind those very public milestones that I mentioned early on, I think we had another better year of quiet, continued cooperation on things that have become very routine in the areas of law enforcement, intelligence, military, and diplomatic fronts. Our cooperation in these areas has been almost routinized, and I think as it continues to grow, there's just a great amount of value there. We have, I think, through those cooperative ventures, while we haven't prevented all of the attacks, we have disrupted conspiracies and taken bad actors off the street and put a real dent in some networks. The challenge that violent extremism presents is not really fading, even given these successes. The factors that make some populations vulnerable to AQ's worldview are still present in too many places. I think there are three things that we're really focused on to get at this problem as we continue and as we go forward. And I want to outline those three very briefly. First is really our bilateral and multilateral partnerships. And I'm really talking here about the diplomatic work we do within the State Department on counterterrorism. Second, for us, creating more capable partners, essentially, by building capacity with our partners. Third, countering violent extremism and getting at some of the ideological issues that underpin AQ and its affiliates. Let me talk first about our partnerships, and I think partnerships, you'll forgive me for saying that word so many times, but it is really at the heart of a lot of our success. Aside from the things that the U.S. military does, aside from the things that our law enforcement does, much of, I think, the successes over the past decade just would not be possible without the strong partnerships we've built. And the effort to create a more common worldview about the challenge that's posed to all of us. I think the national CT strategy that Chuck mentioned went a good ways toward recognizing that partnerships are at the heart of a lot of our success. It's really the first time that the CT strategy has explicitly talked about our partnerships and our cooperation with other countries and the need to even further build capacity with partners to help them get at this problem. We have formal bilateral consultations with too many countries to list, really. Those are primarily aimed at looking for, as I said, ways that we can build commonality, ways to kind of discuss and hopefully get a more common view of the problem. And I do think over looking at the past year, of course, there has been quite a bit of diplomatic activity on the CT front as well around the developments in the Arab world. While a lot of those things are not sort of generated from a CT standpoint, I think what's going on in the Arab world over the last year has gone a good ways toward discrediting the extremist arguments that only violence can produce change. As we hope these movements result in durable and democratically elected governments. Should they, I think, AQ's focus on terrorism as that instrument of political change would be irretrievably delegitimized. That's a strategic blow that would be very hard for them to recover from. We're not blind to the attendant perils of what's happened over the last year in the Arab world. The political turmoil has in some ways distracted security officials. Weapons have gone loose. Some of my colleagues, Chuck mentioned that. The type of civil strife that's gone on in some countries has created an environment that terrorists are inevitably drawn to and tempted to exploit. So we're working with some of those countries, some of whom are already strong CT partners, as they go through transitions, difficult transitions, and looking at ways in which we can assist them to meet the security side of their challenges. I also want to mention here a relatively recent initiative known as the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. And this is a fairly big initiative for us within the administration, an effort to really build up the international architecture for dealing with 21st century threats. The GCTF is really focused on civilian-led rule of law institutions. It's focused on building capacity among its 30 members and beyond the 30 members. And those 30 members are really countries that have a great interest or stake or challenge with terrorism. And I should say 29 plus the European Union. Its aim is really to increase the number of countries capable of dealing with the threats within their borders and their regions. Just a few words, if I might, about some of my colleagues here and the work we're doing with them. India, for one, works very closely with the U.S. on counterterrorism on a wide variety of topics, ranging from threat finance to things like rail security. India has certainly suffered its share at the hands of terrorists, as we saw in 2008. Groups like LET regularly cite both Indian and American interests as legitimate targets. In 2010, our two countries signed the Counterterrorism Cooperation Initiative, MOU, kind of indicative of our good cooperative efforts in this area. Jordan is also one of our closest and most steadfast and longtime CT partners. Training and capacity buildings together with the Kingdom have increased many, many times over in the last decade. And Jordan has not only become one of the most competent countries in the region, in the Arab world, in confronting terrorist threats, but really has become a regional model and a host and training platform for a number of other states, primarily through their International Police Training Center, but other efforts as well. And I just want to note and congratulate them for last week announcing their intention to train 10,000 Libyan security forces members. Turkey, another great ally in counterterrorism, from cooperation on Afghanistan to missile defense radar agreements. And in talking about the GCTF, our partnership, I think it's a great symbol of our partnership that Turkey is the co-chair of that initiative, and it was launched last year in New York by Secretary Clinton and Foreign Minister Davutoglu. Turkey's worked very hard, I think, to build support for the GCTF, providing support to the Secretariat and hosting major international conferences in that area. Turkey faces its own challenges from the PKK, of course. We in the EU have designated the PKK as foreign terrorist organizations, and we have condemned the PKK and their attacks in the strongest possible terms. But there's an ongoing challenge there, certainly. Let me talk a little bit about our capacity building efforts. We, I think, very much see as one of the central challenges to our security and our partners' security the challenge of weak states and really in some ways insufficient states. And when there is a recognition that there are gaps there, we can help. We, through a wide variety of programs, are working to build law enforcement capacity justice programs and the rule of law and good governance in a lot of places. Too many, again, to list. The real overarching objective there is to increase the ability of our partners to address a wide array of threats to public security. And not just in the security sector, but also in the justice sector. We do spend a fair amount of effort training law enforcement officials and police, but this extends to prosecutors, to prison officials, and to the judiciary in an effort to make those capacity building programs more far-reaching, more systematic. It doesn't do a lot of good to arrest people if the system then can't prosecute them and adjudicate them and incarcerate them properly. So I think we're spending more of our time in some of those latter areas, and I think we see a continuation of that going forward. I think we've seen in at least a couple cases that sustained attention from donors, and this includes kind of all of the parts of the U.S. interagency that are involved, combined with sufficient political will on the part of our partners, and ultimately enough dollars can make a difference in those efforts. And we would certainly point to what's, while not perfect, to efforts in Indonesia and Colombia over the last decade or more as fairly successful in this regard. People always ask us for success stories in capacity building, and there are lots of little success stories. Big success stories, I think, take a long time. We also, I think, are very much encouraging our partners, including those seated here, to take the lead in many ways within their region when it comes to capacity building and training efforts of other less capable partners, and I think that's been very successful. I just want to talk briefly about our efforts to more successfully counter violent extremism. And this really gets to the ideology. And in some ways, really what sustains the movement even more than its financing is the flow of new recruits. We've become very adept over the last decade at what Ambassador Benjamin likes to call tactical counterterrorism. We've been very good at taking people off the battlefield, at making, at disrupting networks, at making the environment more hostile. But I think at the strategic level, we simply have to interrupt recruiting in a more systematic way. And this is kind of my bumper sticker. I think a lot of people mean a lot of different things when they say counter-violent extremism. But you know, my short version of this is stop recruiting. And ultimately, I think that's what a lot of our efforts in the CVE area come down to. I think our research and a lot of research has shown that radicalization and recruitment is often driven by factors at that kind of what I would call the hyper-local level, really the street and the neighborhood level, not the provincial level, not the national level, certainly, really not the international level. And I think that means for us, CVE work has to be driven by local needs, has to be informed by local knowledge on the ground, and it has to be responsive to the immediate concerns of the community. And I'm using the word community to mean really almost the neighborhood. It's a top priority for us at the State Department, and I think it's increasingly becoming a top priority for a lot of other parts of the U.S. government. There's a few things that we're trying to do in this area. The first part of that really emphasizes micro-level strategies, customized for specific communities and neighborhoods, that is really aimed at providing alternatives to communities at risk. And I'm not talking about risk of radicalization. Attitudes are one thing, but I'm talking about communities that are at risk of recruitment, people that are at risk of recruitment, mostly young people. Those things, we're convinced, have to be owned by local civil society or local government partners, and I think they have a chance of success. But until we address the very specific drivers that are going on in very local places, I think we don't have a chance here. The second part is, of course, the narrative. The drivers are one thing. The narrative, I think, is is what people who have some sort of cognitive opening, some sort of drivers in this direction, the narrative is kind of what pulls them. And it's not about public diplomacy. It's not about improving the U.S. image. It's about reaching out to a pretty well-defined and pretty narrow audience, and that's people that could be persuaded into crossing the boundaries between sympathy and action. Last year, to this purpose, our office helped stand up the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communication, known as the CSCC, inside the State Department, an interagency effort to push back against AQ's online presence and AQ's media activities, and really to contest that online space, whether it's traditional media or websites, new media, forums, chat rooms, where extremists have spread lies and recruited followers. And last, kind of in this area, we are very focused on strengthening our partners' ability and our partners' capacity and engagement in this area, propagating what we see as some of the best practices. I don't think there's a lot out there right now, but I think there are some small things that have worked in some small places, and trying to build more of an international consensus behind the need to address recruiting. That's kind of an overview. I think what we've seen over the last year points to some innovative and new strategies on the part of our adversaries, and that obviously requires some creative strategies on our own part. Just about a month ago, as Dr. Alexander mentioned, I think the Secretary recognizing, I think, that we were in a little different place now in counterterrorism. A decade after 9/11, she upgraded the Office of the Coordinator to a bureau within the State Department. This was one of the recommendations of the QDDR that was published about a year ago. And I think for us, that's really about strengthening civilian-led diplomacy in this area. And it's really in many of the areas I mentioned, in capacity building, in countering violent extremism, and in engaging with our partners and with the international community on the CT front, and raising the profile and strengthening the role of the civilian side of the U.S. government on all of those fronts. I think we've made some good progress, not just in the last year, over the last several years. I would agree with Chuck. I think AQ has hit its high watermark a while ago, but there's plenty to do next year, and well beyond that. So, thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for coming.
Very kind.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your overview. Particularly, it is significant to see the elevation of your office, which really underscores the commitment, I think, of the United States for a strategic partnership with the international community. Now we're going to move on to specific countries and activities on the counter-terrorism. We're delighted to have a number of distinguished diplomats. The first one is Ambassador Arun Singh, who currently is Deputy Chief of Mission. The embassy has a very distinguished experience and career, serving both headquarters in Delhi as well as at embassies abroad, such as Moscow, and his last post was an ambassador of India to Israel. Mr. Ambassador, please.
Dr. Yona Alexander, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege for me to have this opportunity to share India's views on the issue of international cooperation to combat terrorism. Despite the successes that were achieved last year, and there were already several references today to those, terrorism still constitutes among the most serious challenges to international peace and security. Not just India, but the US and many other countries have been victims of this scourge now for several decades. There's hardly any region in the world that has not been scarred by terrorism. The heinous terrorist attacks in New York, Bali, Kabul, London, Madrid, Moscow, Mumbai, and in several places on several occasions are some of the examples of the ugly imprints of this phenomenon. The wanton acts of terrorism, killing of innocent civilians, on one hand leads to a direct human cost, the loss and the void which the immediate family members and close friends have to face. At another level, such acts put stress on the fabric of society, especially open, pluralistic, and democratic societies, and undermine peace, democracy, and freedom. This, in the longer run, is the more dangerous threat. It is against this background that I'd like to take a few minutes to briefly describe what we in India have attempted over the last several years to deal with the challenge of terrorism. And I'd also like to give an idea of how India and the US are now pooling their resources to fight this common threat. It is a truism now to say that India lives in perhaps one of the most difficult neighborhoods in the world. This region is half the world away for the US, but it is in our immediate neighborhood. Terrorism emanating from there has posed a challenge to peace and stability, not just in India, but now globally. For policymakers in India, the question thus is how to deal with terrorism emanating from outside our borders and directed deliberately against us. For a strategy to be effective, it would need to have several components. First is obviously to strengthen domestic capabilities to prevent such attacks from happening. This involves upgrading our defensive capabilities, including through the use of latest technologies and strengthening intelligence gathering capacities. The second is to foster greater international cooperation. As today, terrorist groups collaborate seamlessly, and it is hard to make distinctions between them. Sometimes we hear distinctions being made between so-called global jihadis and local jihadis. But in our own experience, we have found that these distinctions are not really without any basis. Whatever kind of groupings we tend to put them in, they cooperate with each other and tend to support each other. Finally, the third component would be to facilitate such an environment which would discourage misguided or brainwashed youth to choose the path of terrorism. In India, we have tried to develop a comprehensive strategy that includes domestic steps, measures to promote peace and stability in the region, and also to encourage international cooperation. In our neighborhood, for instance, we have tried to follow a strategy that is based on political engagement with all our neighbors, assistance for economic development, improved connectivity, and market access. We believe that a stable, peaceful, and prosperous neighborhood is vital for the security of the people of India. We have progressed in developing healthy and normal relations with most of the countries in our neighborhood. Our relations with Pakistan have been complicated by the issue of terrorism. We desire friendly and cooperative relations with Pakistan and believe that a stable Pakistan, which acts as a bulwark against terrorism and extremism in its own interest, would also contribute to better relations with India. At the national level, especially after the Mumbai terror attack of November 26, 2008, we have taken several steps to develop comprehensive and integrated national counterterrorism strategies that fully comply with the rule of law, fully respect dignity and human rights of all, and reach out to and actively involve all parts of society and all communities. We have also tried to ensure that such strategies effectively address the conditions conducive to the spread, conditions which are otherwise conducive to the spread of terrorism, including radicalization and recruitment of terrorists. As a part of this strategy, we have, for instance, recently decided to set up a national counterterrorism center in a manner similar to what was done in the US. And this would collate all intelligence inputs from various agencies, analyze them, and disseminate them to operational agencies. Apart from strengthening our strategic and operational framework to combat terrorism effectively, we have also amended and strengthened domestic legislation. A new legislation that was adopted in 2004 incorporates provisions dealing with all aspects of terrorism, including conspiracy and incitement to terrorism. It criminalizes raising of funds for terrorist activities, holding of proceeds of terrorism, harboring of terrorists, unauthorized possession or use of any bomb, dynamite or hazardous explosive substance or other lethal weapons. The Weapons of Mass Destruction Prevention Act 2005, adopted in India, provides detailed measures preventing the falling of weapons of mass destruction or dual-use materials in the hands of terrorists and non-state actors. The role of international cooperation in combating terrorism is indeed vital if we are to deal effectively with this menace. Today, terrorists are not only truly globalized, but are also waging an asymmetric warfare against the international community. They recruit in one country, raise funds in another, and operate in yet others. They have global logistical and supply chains. They have developed transnational financial systems. They use the latest and most sophisticated technologies and have command and control mechanisms that are able to operate across continents on a real-time basis. To give just one example of this global interlinkage, in the case of the Mumbai terror attack in 2008, in which close to 200 persons had lost their lives, in Chicago in 2010, the FBI apprehended 2 US citizens who had been involved in scouting the sites which had then come under attack in November. We feel, therefore, that in addition to taking national measures, countries across the globe need to take steps to enhance their cooperation. India has concluded so far 40 bilateral treaties on extradition and mutual legal assistance in criminal matters so as to enhance international cooperation. India is also an active member of the Financial Action Task Force to effectively monitor and cooperate. We have also set up a financial intelligence unit. In the United Nations, we have been playing an active role in strengthening the international legal framework. We are party to the 13 sectoral conventions on terrorism adopted by the UN. We have also supported the various anti-terrorism mechanisms and resolutions established by the UN Security Council. With the objective of providing a comprehensive legal framework to combat terrorism, India took the initiative to pilot a draft comprehensive convention on international terrorism at the UN. This is still under discussion. A few issues remain to be resolved. As a member of the Security Council, India's permanent representative to the UN presently chairs the Security Council Committee on Counterterrorism and the working group concerning threats to international peace and security by terrorist attacks. Let me, in conclusion, say a few words about our cooperation with the US. One of the key elements of the India-US strategic partnership has been in the area of cooperating to deal with terrorism. We have, over the years, established several mechanisms. These include the Joint Working Group on Counterterrorism, which was set up in 2000. Among the areas for cooperation and initiatives are: 1, strengthening capabilities to effectively combat terrorism; promotion of exchanges regarding modernization of techniques; sharing of best practices; development of investigative skills; promotion of cooperation between forensic science laboratories; establishment of procedures to provide mutual investigative assistance; enhancing liaison and training between specialist counterterrorism units, including the National Security Guard of India with their US counterparts. There are several other institutional forums where we have been cooperating, including a bilateral working group on aviation security, a bilateral working group on information and communication technology, and the defense policy group. Another important milestone was added when President Obama had visited India in November 2010. The two leaders announced a new Homeland Security dialogue between the Ministry of Home Affairs of India and Department of Homeland Security of the US. This dialogue was formally launched in May last year when Secretary Napolitano had visited India. It focuses on a program of cooperation in global supply chain management, megacity policing, combating counterfeit currency and illicit financing, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure protection, capacity building, and technology upgrading. We are also partnering with the US in the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, to which a reference was made by Dan Rosen. Overall, therefore, we have created a good edifice for fostering and strengthening our cooperation in counterterrorism in all its aspects. This, along with the strong political support that exists in both our countries, we are confident that our cooperation in this vital area will only grow in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your overview. I would be remiss if I'm not going to mention the academic cooperation with India. In fact, I recall very vividly that Mike Swetnam and I had the opportunity to do some field work in India for this book, the first book on Al-Qaeda, and before 9/11, and we developed some very strong links with the universities and scholars in India. Our next speaker, according to the program, as you can see, is the Honorable Timur Sarlamins from Turkey, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission, and he has a very rich background in Ankara, as well as the United Nations. And I recall vividly going all the way back to 2002 when you were at the embassy. At that particular time, also with the current ambassador, Namik Tan, I think, about the same time. Again, as far as the academic work, I would like to mention to you that currently we have a special relationship with the Center of Excellence, Defense Against Terrorism in Ankara, which is a NATO actually body, as well as we have seminars and conferences and so forth. We provide academic support, as well as the Partnership for Peace Center in Ankara, and we publish a journal together through the Potomac, the Inter-University Center, which is being published in Ankara. And those of you who might be interested, we can provide you with copies. Timur, please.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Professor Alexander, really, for not only putting this important seminar together, but also keeping the discussion going on what is really an existential, incredibly important issue. Before I proceed to my remarks, where I'll try to give you a perspective on how we in Turkey see the whole fight against international terrorism, and in particular the international cooperation dimension, I do take note that I've been given about 10-15 minutes, so I must recollect a meeting I was in at the UN. It was on decolonization, and about 180 members had spoken. So one of the representatives of a larger country took the floor and said, you know, Mr. Chairman, everything important that needs to be said has been said, but not everyone has said it. So in view of time, I'll try not to repeat a lot of the things, a lot of the very important things that have already been said, and to most of which we already subscribe. The truth is that 2011 was a very important year, a banner year, as was said. A lot of significant developments did happen. But the reality is that the challenge is still very much present, and it's also evolving. It's changing shape and adapting, just like we're adapting to the threat and the ways in which we combat it. So there is, as was the case 30, 40 years ago, as was the case 10 years ago, there is no room for complacency. There is no room for moral relativism. We have to continue to fight this scourge in all of its manifestations and in all the ways that it presents itself. At the same time, of course, Turkey has long suffered from terrorism. We've suffered from different forms of it. From the 70s to the 80s, we had Asala terrorism. November 17th, we had extreme political religious terrorism during the early 80s. And today we suffer from PKK terrorism, not to name some other extreme groups as well. The reality is that in our fight against terrorism, we have to be decisive. There is no room for flexibility. There's no room for negotiation. We have to make sure that we are successful in our fight. Otherwise, the smallest window of opportunity that is out there will be used to the fullest extent. At the same time, of course, our fight against terrorism has to be legitimate. It has to be based on democratic principles. It has to be based on the rule of law. So those are incredibly, I think, important tenets as we look at the fight in general, especially from an international approach. When we look at our fight against PKK terrorism, we have tried to take a comprehensive approach. The security component obviously is indispensable, but not alone sufficient in the long term. So you have to look at also the social, political, cultural, and economic aspects and how, as a method, terrorism is not only manifesting itself, but getting the different support from different dimensions that it does. But again, at the same time, not forgetting that the continuous efforts to enhance democratic standards, democratic rights, and fundamental freedoms also is an important element of the whole. When we look at the international situation, I think as we have been saying for a very, very long time, and as we will continue to say consistently, international solidarity and cooperation is absolutely essential. I cannot overstate the importance of this. Ambassador Singh, I think, very importantly mentioned the fact that there are efforts in the UN for a convention. The reality, the sad story, is that we don't have a convention on terrorism, an international convention, and we don't have a definition. And at the UN, there are endless meetings, and I think it's very, very important for a country like India to be spearheading this effort, and we certainly will give that effort our whole support, because all nations have to agree on a definition, and we have to proceed with working together effectively across the board to fight this scourge. There are already very important instruments in place at the UN that help us fight international terrorism. We have to make sure that all countries live up to their obligations. This is not always the case. From our own experience, we can say that for example, PKK finds safe haven in neighboring countries. We understand the difficulties involved, but at the same time, the solidarity, again, cooperation has to be 100%. And if we don't have that cooperation, then obviously we have problems. Again, similarly, we have the PKK finding elaborate support structures in Europe. This continues to be a problem from the aspect of financing, extortion activities, recruitment, propaganda, and of course drug trafficking. These are all different methods in which terrorist organizations find the means to perpetuate their activities. So when we look at the problem, not only from our own perspective, but from an international perspective, we, at least in Turkey, come to the realization that you need a very comprehensive approach, a comprehensive approach that includes lots of different elements that are used together, and all of them must be equally effective. So we're looking at, obviously, military and security measures, but this can only be one part of the puzzle. We're talking about targeting financial support structures, border management, incredibly important, narco-terrorism, ransom, extortion, kidnapping activities. These are, of course, have a law enforcement and prosecution aspect to them. Recruitment and propaganda tools of terror organizations is something that we have to deal with, which of course brings us to cyberspace, a very important area where international cooperation and national capabilities are very important. And also, of course, we have to remember as people working for governments that bureaucracies are by definition very cumbersome and ill-equipped to adapt to threats which are based essentially on very loose networks. So we have to think on those terms as well. We cannot function within a hierarchical bureaucratic regime when we're looking at threats that are much more agile than the ones that we're used to dealing with. At the same time, I mentioned the fact that there is no convention or no definition. This is important also because there is always a tendency, and politics of course comes into play at an international level, to be selective, to look at one terrorist organization and say, well, you know, that's their problem, it's not our problem. But the reality is that all terrorist organizations collaborate in one way or another and use similar networks, use similar means. And more often than not, they exist in safe havens, and to the point where they're not able to target cross-border operations, they start targeting in the country that has given them safe harbor. We've seen this in the past, and I think we'll see this in the future. And this is, again, another compelling reason why international cooperation continues to be of paramount importance. The UN framework, as was mentioned, is crucial, and we'll continue to work in that framework. The Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy agreed to by the UN General Assembly is very important. The resolutions agreed to by the UN Security Council are very important. They're very important mechanisms and committees that have been established. Turkey had the privilege to chair the committee that India now chairs, and have seen the challenges and also the opportunities that are there at the UN to advance this agenda. In this regard, I think capacity building comes across as a very, very important priority, because while there might be political will on the part of a lot of countries to help, they don't necessarily have the means institutionally, capacity-wise, to deliver that support. And in that regard, the global the forum that we have the honor to co-chair with the U.S. It's a very new initiative, but the Global Counterterrorism Forum, I think, is incredibly important in realizing the strategy that we have at the UN and exchanging information, because the reality is that a lot of different countries have a lot of different experiences. Similar experiences, but also different experiences. And the truth is, governments and those in bureaucracies make mistakes. We have to learn from those mistakes. We have to have our lessons learned. We have to compare our notes so that collectively we can tackle these incredibly important threats. In this regard, I have to say, and this is very, very important to us from a Turkish perspective, that the U.S. Is our leading partner in our counterterrorism efforts, has been for a very long time. I think the motto that a friend in need is a friend indeed applies to no one else internationally than the United States, and we're ever grateful for that, and we'll continue to be. We will work together. We will look to expand that cooperation, but obviously the PKK is just one aspect of that cooperation. There are a lot of bad people out there with a lot of bad intentions. There is another threat that is rearing its head, and one that we believe really we have to be very careful about, and that's driven by xenophobia. We are seeing this, the manifestations of this in Europe. What we saw in Norway was an attempt at terrorizing a community, terrorizing a region and a people. We've seen, it has just been uncovered in Germany, extreme far-right groups using terror activities against ethnic minorities. These are very, very dangerous new emerging phenomenon that we have to pay attention to, because if history and if our past experiences have taught us anything, it is that these organizations will also go in the same direction. There is much obviously debate about the Arab Spring, much debate about the transformation in this region. There was some mention to it at the very beginning. We have a saying in Turkey that, that wolves like foggy weather. The fact is that while there's a lot of promise and there's a lot of excitement about the aspirations that are manifested in the region, the transformation and the events that are going on in all these countries do allow for a lot of people with a lot of ill intentions to operate in very dangerous ways. So that's something that we'll all have to look at very carefully as well. So to wrap up, I would just say that this is a, like I said at the very beginning, an existential problem. It's a very serious threat for all countries around the world, and international cooperation, international solidarity, and effective cooperation is absolutely paramount. So we have to keep working at it. It's a work in progress. It's never perfect, but to the extent that we work together, I think we've seen in the past and will continue to see in the future, we'll gain more successes. Thank you.
Thank you again. After our last panelists, we'll have the opportunity for Q&A. I would like to introduce the Honorable Mahmoud Hamoud, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission. On a personal level, I was honored to attend the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel that Mahmoud contributed to in terms of his role of legal advisor to the kingdom, both in Oman and at the United Nations, particularly his contributions at the UN to advance the cause of international law with justice. And what is most interesting that just the past few weeks, Jordan, as you know, tried to bring together the Palestinians and the Israelis to renew the discussions and negotiations and to advance the cause of peace in the Middle East. Hamoud?
First of all, I would like to thank the Potomac Institute and Professor Alexander for their invitation to participate in this important discussion on the international effort in combating terrorism. I would also like to thank my colleagues on the panel for their important comments that they have just made. Ladies and gentlemen, I was thinking this morning before I wrote my speech to talk about Jordan, but then I thought mostly you can find it on the UN website and other public record out there with regard to Jordan efforts, obviously, which is not in the public record. I don't have the capacity to speak on. So basically, I'm going to talk about the international efforts to combat terrorism, and I'm happy to answer any question with regard specifically to Jordan. Terrorism is an issue which has challenged the international community for centuries, although it came under the spotlight only in recent decades and became a priority in foreign relations and international cooperation in the wake of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks in the United States. Despite the huge progress in the international, regional, and bilateral efforts to fight the phenomenon, there remains an inherent element of difficulty in dealing with terrorism, which is the different perceptions of nations of what constitutes terrorism and the use of the term for political purposes. Again, this is not a new problem. As far back as the negotiations of the 1906 Hague Accords, or Hague Regulations on land warfare, the then superpowers were not able to agree on the elements of the act that would be prohibited under the Hague Regulations. Of course, for political reasons, what some negotiating states considered as terrorism, others considered as legitimate freedom fighting. Nevertheless, the law of armed conflict, including the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, prohibit acts of terrorism during armed conflict by the parties. Despite the lack of definition, IHL makes it clear that attacks by any party which aims at spreading terror among the civilians is prohibited. Due to the political difficulties, there were no serious efforts to adopt any international instrument to combat terrorism during the time of peace, until the phenomenon of aircraft hijacking became a serious international concern. This is when the 1963 Tokyo Convention on Offenses and Certain Other Acts on Board Aircraft was adopted. Since then, another 13 so-called sectoral conventions to combat terrorism were adopted. Such instruments dealt with only specific crimes of terrorism, and some of them provided definition of the terrorist act or crime for the specific purposes of each convention, and not a general definition that would serve as a cornerstone for combating terrorism. They also provided for efforts of cooperation and minimum national standards that need to be applied, again, only for the specific purposes of each convention. The United Nations has been for over a decade trying to adopt, as my colleagues have stated, a comprehensive convention on combating international terrorism, but has failed to do so due mainly to disagreement on what constitutes a terrorist crime, but most importantly on the scope of application of the convention. Due to the deadlock over such issues, several states on both sides of the debate are questioning whether there is ever a need to adopt the draft instrument, considering that there are more than a dozen international sectoral conventions and many more regional and bilateral instruments to combat terrorism. I would argue otherwise for several reasons, but most importantly, that a comprehensive convention would provide a general definition of terrorist acts that has the legitimacy and which can be used effectively to combat the phenomenon. The Security Council in 2004 adopted Resolution 1566, which can be argued provides for elements of a definition of a terrorist act. The problem here is the body which adopted the so-called definition and its authority to impose a definition on the international community. Despite the abundance of international, regional, and bilateral international legal instruments combating terrorism, such instruments were only used when all the relevant states found it appropriate to resort to an instrument to deal with a specific case of terrorism. That is, the legal aspects were only used to serve the common political interest in a certain situation. This has changed in the wake of September 11 terrorist attacks. This is when the Security Council adopted the first of several decisions requiring states to take effective national and international measures to combat terrorism and cooperate amongst each other in this regard. I would like here to note that Resolution 1267 was adopted by the Council in 1999, but was Al-Qaeda specific sanctions regime and not a comprehensive international counter-terrorism approach. The adoption of Resolution 1373 following the September 11 attacks has been considered a landmark for transformation of international efforts to combat terrorism on all levels, legislative, judicial, and executive. It was the beginning of serious UN efforts to monitor compliance and assist states in building and consolidating their counter-terrorism infrastructure. Thus, combating terrorism was no longer an intellectual legal debate, and states started feeling compelled to act, whether through the adoption of robust measures to limit financial support to terrorism, to effective border measures to prevent terrorism-related activities and support. Such measures have yielded considerable success in preventing terrorist activities, tracking down their perpetrators, and bringing them to justice, and tightening the circle around those who resort or intend to resort to terrorism. Nevertheless, the multiplicity of instruments and international and regional arrangements may also pose a risk on the effectiveness of efforts to combat terrorism. This is in addition to the fact that the Security Council-led approach has posed difficulties to many countries, including the most ardent supporters of international counter-terrorism efforts. There is no more obvious example than the struggle of the EU countries to implement the terrorist designation and listing requirements by the relevant Security Council sanctions bodies. Their national as well as the European courts have in several instances considered individual rights prevalent over any measure they view to be inconsistent with such rights. One last point. The success achieved internationally in combating terrorism has been achieved by treating the act as a crime and not as an act of war. Despite the rhetoric, the international-led efforts that achieved such a success were law enforcement efforts, whether resulting from or directed by the Security Council or from another bilateral or multilateral arrangement. The war on terror is no more than the war on poverty, the war against epidemics, or the war on drugs. An armed conflict remains under international law, a conflict between parties who satisfy the legal requirements to be considered so. Thus, an armed conflict cannot be between a party and a phenomenon. It has to be between at least two or more parties, including non-state actors, which fit the definition of a party to an armed conflict. And despite views of some who want the law to serve politics, the laws of armed conflict, as well as the principles of state territorial integrity and sovereignty, have not changed. The bottom line is that both international law and international law remain capable of effectively dealing with the problem of terrorism as long as the international community is serious in confronting it. And thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud, for dealing with the significance of the rule of law in the strategy to combat terrorism and the role of international organization. Now, on the logistical level, two of our distinguished speakers have to leave very shortly, Charlie Allen and Ambassador Singh. So what I would suggest, if you have a specific question directed to them, now is the time, and then we'll have a little bit time to ask the other panelists. Any question to Charlie Allen or to Ambassador Singh? State your name, please, and affiliation, and a short question, not a big statement.
My name is Dr. Baba Susilan from Pennsylvania. After listening to all the speakers here, I was reminded of an interview I had with a criminal in Pennsylvania correctional institution. I asked him why you are in prison. He said, I did some crime. What are the crimes you did? He put an ad in Wall Street Journal and he said, reduce your heating expenses. So many people send money. And what he said? He sent a one-word letter. The only way to reduce your expenses for heating is reduce your thermostat. And he also put another ad that the easy way to kill all the bed bugs in your home is use my instrument. He sent 20 toothpicks. My question is, after listening to all of this, you have not addressed the plurality of causes that create this terrorism. We spend billions and billions of dollars to wipe out Al-Qaeda terrorists, Bin Laden, we kill them. That is good. But if you want to reduce the plurality of the causes and want to save taxpayers' expenses, what causes this terrorism? What are the plurality? Nobody has addressed the plurality of causes.
Thank you.
Ambassador, my question is, you said nobody has defined terrorism. We know what terrorism is, what is jihadi terrorism.
I'm sorry to...
Anytime...
Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt you simply because of the interest of time.
Yeah, what question?
You made a statement.
Anytime you define a concept, you are reducing the meaning and impact of the concept. So we don't need any definition. We know who is committing the terrorism, what are the causes of terrorism, how to reduce.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to stop. Anyone wants to respond to this? Okay, I'm going to move on to Ambassador Marks. Short question.
Thank you again for a very robust and rich discussion. There's one subject was touched on I'd like to hear some more comment on it, and that's what is the relationship between the three members of what you might call a political menage a trois, which is the Pakistani government, the ISI military side, and the Taliban. So subjects that goes around, and I'd appreciate any comments any members of the panel would like to say on that.
I don't want to really comment on this. This is a very delicate issue. The Taliban, as you know, and you know the history of the Taliban, sir, and how it grew in the 90s. It did have external support, and it grew into a very strong and very Salafist fundamentalist group, basically Pashto, and it gave a home to Osama bin Laden when they came in '96, and the attacks then occurred here on our embassies in 1998 and then 9/11. But specifics on relating to the Taliban, Pakistan, and the ISI, I just don't have any comment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, would you like to respond to that?
Our position, articulated for a very long time consistently, has been that it is clear that terrorist groups have been receiving support from state structures in Pakistan. So let me leave it at that.
Sir, we're in a civil society, please. I think both Charlie Allen and Ambassador Singh were very generous with their time. They have some other obligation, and I would like to thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's a great pleasure to be here and a great pleasure to address this audience on behalf of myself. I represent only myself in this statement, not the government. Those are my independent views. It's been a very fine year as far as 2011, but I think, as Dan Rosen and others have pointed out, our colleagues from Jordan and Turkey and India, we face an enduring problem. It's one I think that the American public is ready to deal with and has more maturity. The international relationship that Dan Rosen laid out, I thought was a wonderful exposition of the cooperation that we have in all domains. It takes the whole of government, both foreign and domestic, to combat extremism. I think we've made progress, but this is a multi-decade effort. It's going to go on. Terrorism has been with us for many centuries. It's not going to go away. But the forms and the methods of terrorism have become extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily damaging. So it's going to take extraordinary vigilance. I want to thank both Mike and Professor Alexander for emphasizing the international cooperation that is absolutely essential if we're going to continue to maintain the kind of containment that we've seen over the past year.
Okay, thank you. Mike, you want to say a word?
I'll only by saying that, as you'll notice today and throughout all of our ambassador forums for the last several years, the emphasis on the global nature of the threat and the emphasis on the need for global cooperation to deal with it. It's been, there's still many, many parts of the world and many people who look at terrorism and the fear that comes out of terrorism as a local thing that affects us. As was said earlier by a couple of the distinguished gentlemen, an act of terror in any one of our countries is a threat against all of us. It's a threat against the human race. And the cooperation that has been growing by leaps and bounds across the world and been demonstrated in the comments here today, I think is something that should give us all encouragement that that this is being dealt with in a way that can give us some faith that the future that our children and our grandchildren will face will be better than the one that we've faced over the last couple decades. So please join me in thanking these tremendous and honorable gentlemen, not just for their comments, but for the great work of their countries that they represent.